Henry Callahan had spent his life building things. Decks that held families through summer barbecues, stone walls that stood firm against New England winters, and driveways that carried the weight of years without cracking. A landscape contractor by trade, his hands bore the scars of hard work, calloused, tanned, and steady. At 58, he'd traded the hustle of Boston for the quiet of Willow Creek, a small town in coastal Maine where the air smelled of pine and salt. His new home was modest, a two-story Cape Cod with weathered shingles, a tin roof that hummed in the rain, and a long gravel driveway that wound through a sloped acre of land. It was his first real stake in peace, a place to rebuild after a divorce that had left him raw and a business that had crumbled under the pressure of cut-rate competitors. The driveway was his pride. 50 yards of compacted gravel, edged with smooth river stones, and shaded by 2 ancient maples he'd pruned himself. It curved gently from Birch Lane, ending in a wide clearing by the garage. The property was Privatino sidewalk, no through traffic, no ambiguity. Henry had checked the deed twice, even walked the boundary with a surveyor's map. This was his land, his sanctuary. For the first few months, Willow Creek delivered on its promise. Henry cleared overgrown brush, reshaped the front yard into terraced garden beds, and ignored the neighborhood's group chat, which buzzed with potluck plans and emoji-heavy enthusiasm. He wasn't antisocial, wave to dog walkers or nod at joggers, but he'd earned the right to his space. Then came the morning he met Susan Hargrove. It was a foggy Tuesday, the kind where mist clung to the trees like a veil. Henry was watering his roses when Susan strode up his driveway, pulling a red wagon stacked with folding chairs. 2 kids, maybe 6 or 7, trailed behind, kicking pebbles. She wore an oversized sun hat and a t-shirt proclaiming "World's Greatest Mom" in rhinestone letters. Without pausing, she crossed the edge of his property, gave a curt nod, and called out, "Just cutting through. School drop-offs, a zoo today." Henry blinked, caught off guard. "This is private property," he said, keeping his tone even. Susan didn't break stride. She laughed a sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, don't worry. Everyone does it. You'll get used to it." And with that, she vanished down the hill toward the street. That was the start. Over the next month, the intrusions grew bolder. Kids from the nearby elementary school ran through his yard during recess, trampling his newly planted ferns. Teenagers on bikes tore across the gravel, leaving tire ruts and candy wrappers. Once, a neighbor in a pickup parked half on his lawn, engrossed in a phone call. Henry tried addressing it calmly. "This isn't a public path," he'd say, or, "Please stick to the road." The responses were always the same: confused looks, shrugs, or a breezy, "We thought it was fine. It's not gated." He considered a gate but hated the idea of fencing himself in to fix other people's behavior. Instead, he put up signs: "Private driveway. No public access." Within days, one was spray-painted blue, another stolen. Henry's patience, forged through decades of dealing with difficult clients, began to fray. The tipping point came on a Saturday morning. Henry woke to a rhythmic thumping, like a distant heartbeat. He dressed slowly, assuming it was a neighbor's music, and stepped onto his porch with a mug of black coffee. What he saw stopped him cold. A massive inflatable bounce house, neon yellow with red turrets, sat dead center in his driveway, staked deep into the gravel. Folding tables lined its edges, covered with cupcakes and soda cans. Balloons bobbed from his maples. Susan stood in the middle, clipboard in hand, wearing a wireless headset like a wedding planner. Cars 8 or 9 were parked haphazardly along his lawn and up the shoulder, blocking any chance of getting in or out. Henry's jaw tightened. He walked forward, coffee still in hand, as Susan spotted him. Her smile was wide, performative. "Morning, neighbor," she chirped, striding over. "Big day for Ethan's 10th birthday. We needed a little extra space, and your driveway was perfect. You're not using it right. You put this on my property without asking," Henry said, his voice low but sharp. Susan tilted her head, unfazed. "It's just one day. We'll be out by tonight. Come join us. There's burgers, music, even a petting zoo coming. It's all kid-friendly." "I need to leave," Henry said. "You're blocking my access." She laughed again, this time with an edge. "Don't be a grump. It's for the kids. Be a sport." Before he could respond, she turned back to her clipboard, dismissing him. For a moment, Henry considered retreating inside, letting it slide. But something shifted. This wasn't just a neighbor overstepping. It was a deliberate challenge, a line crossed with a smile. Susan wasn't just using his land, she was claiming it. And Henry Callahan, who'd built his life on boundaries and hard work, wasn't about to let that stand. He returned to the house, not in defeat, but with purpose. Sitting at his kitchen table, he opened a notebook and began documenting the time, the number of cars, the bounce house's exact position. He noted the woman in a denim jacket who'd just crushed his azaleas with a cooler. This wasn't anger, it was strategy. In his line of work, disputes were won with evidence, not shouting. Outside, the party grew louder. The bounce house wheezed with every jump, and a portable speaker blared pop music. Henry watched from his window as a man in flip-flops chugged a beer and wandered behind his shrubs to relieve himself. That was it. He picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher, a young woman with a tired voice, listened as Henry explained the trespassing, the obstruction, the unauthorized party. "We'll send someone when we can," she said. "It's a busy weekend." Henry thanked her and hung up, settling into his armchair to wait. An hour later, the bounce house tipped. A group of kids had piled onto one side, loosening a stake. It sagged, sending children scrambling and Susan storming out, yelling into her headset about scheduling errors. Cupcakes toppled, balloons tangled in the trees, and the speaker shorted out after a soda spill. The chaos was almost comical, but no one moved the cars or cleared the driveway. When the police arrived an hour and a half after the cowlet was a single officer, barely 25, looking overwhelmed. Susan pounced before he reached the driveway, gesturing wildly and talking fast. Henry waited on his porch, arms crossed. The officer, introducing himself as Officer Tate, approached. "Mr. Callahan, we've got a situation here. There's some confusion about property lines." "There's no confusion," Henry said firmly. "This is my land. I have the deed and survey. They're trespassing." Tate shifted, glancing at his tablet. "Mrs. Hargrove says there's a shared access agreement." "There isn't," Henry replied. The officer sighed. "I can't make a legal call right now. How about I ask them to move the party and wrap up early?" "They're breaking the law," Henry said. "I called you to enforce that." Tate hesitated. "If you press charges, this could get messy. I'm trying to keep it simple." Henry saw Susan watching from a distance, arms crossed, her expression daring him to push. He didn't press charges, not yet. Instead, he handed Tate a laminated copy of his deed and survey. "Please note that I've informed you of my rights and will seek restitution if this happens again." Tate took photos of the documents and returned to Susan. After a tense exchange, the bounce house began to deflate. By late afternoon, the cars were gone, the tables packed, leaving only tire marks and trampled grass. Susan didn't apologize. She didn't even look at him. But Henry knew this wasn't over. The next morning, a flyer was taped to his mailbox. Community meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m. Topic: shared access and neighborhood pathways. Host: Susan Hargrove. The message was clear, she was doubling down. And Henry Callahan wasn't about to let her rewrite the rules of his land. Henry Callahan didn't sleep much the night after the bounce house incident. His mind churned, replaying Susan's dismissive laugh, the officer's hesitance, the neighbors' silence as they watched the chaos unfold. By morning, the flyer on his mailbox felt like a declaration of war, not loud, not violent, but calculated. Susan wasn't backing down. She was organizing, turning his private driveway into a public cause. Henry knew he couldn't ignore it. If he did, the next intrusion wouldn't be a party, it'd be a precedent. He spent the week in quiet preparation, moving through his routine with the precision of a man who'd faced disputes before. He trimmed his garden beds, repaired the crushed patches of lawn, and power washed the tire marks off his gravel. But the air had shifted. Neighbors who once waved now avoided his gaze. The dog walker who'd always nodded hurried past, eyes on the ground. A woman who used to chat about hydrangeas turned inside when Henry stepped out. It wasn't hostility, it was complicity, the kind that came from whispers and half-truths. Susan was weaving a narrative, and the street was buying it. Henry had no intention of attending her community meeting. He knew what it was, a stage for Susan to play the hero, framing his driveway as a shared resource and himself as the grumpy outsider who hated kids. She'd use buzzwords like community spirit and family-friendly, letting smiles and subtext do the heavy lifting. Instead, Henry called an old contact from his contracting days, a land use attorney named Clara Bennett. Clara was no-nonsense, with a knack for cutting through bureaucratic fog. She didn't promise miracles, only results. "Send me everything," she said. "Deed, survey, photos, your notes. If she's pushing this, we'll push back harder." Clara attended the meeting in Henry's place, sitting silently with a legal pad, taking notes like a stenographer. The next day, she delivered a report that read like a battle plan. Susan had claimed the bounce house was moved to Henry's driveway due to last-minute school maintenance, a lie with no evidence. She'd floated the idea of a public-use easement across several properties, including Henry's, to create neighbor-friendly pathways. She never mentioned the police, the vandalism, or Henry's repeated objections, dismissing trespassing concerns as a misunderstanding. One attendee questioned her, but Susan deflected with charm, insisting it was all for the greater good. Clara's summary was blunt. She's not retreating. She's escalating. 2 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail from a zoning consultant named Paul Whitaker. It was polite but chilling, stating that the town's planning board had received a community use inquiry about Henry's driveway. Phrases like exploratory assessment and potential connectivity initiative masked the threat. Susan was trying to reclassify his land as semi-public. If the inquiry gained traction, it could lead to an easement hearing, where his property rights might be eroded under the guise of public benefit. Henry didn't panic. He gathered his documents title, survey, Google Earth images spanning a decade, even his original real estate correspondence. He sent them to Clara, who began drafting a preemptive response to kill the inquiry before it became a formal petition. But Susan wasn't relying on paperwork alone. She was playing to the crowd. By the weekend, Henry's driveway became a symbol. Kids on scooters lingered at the property line, parents hovering nearby as if staking a claim. Chalk drawings appeared on the road just beyond his gravel hearts, stars, the word share, in wobbly letters. They weren't on his land, but the message was clear. Then came another flyer, announcing a summer family block party, with a petting zoo and food trucks. Henry's address wasn't listed, but the map circled his driveway as the gravel access point. He drove to City Hall that Monday, not to argue, but to file a notarized declaration of ownership, demanding notification of any proposed encroachments. The clerk, a weary man named Carl, skimmed the packet and sighed. "You're not the first to deal with this. People try to turn private land public by making enough noise." That evening, Henry walked his property with a measuring wheel and a can of white spray paint, refreshing the faded boundary lines. He drove reflective stakes into the ground, just like he'd done on job sites, and installed a new sign at the driveway's entrance, bolted into concrete. "Private property. No access. Trespassing enforced." By morning, it was gone, not broken, not toppled, but removed. In its place was a laminated poster zip-tied to a maple, showing a cartoon sun and the words, "Let's keep our streets friendly. Share the space." Henry didn't flinch. He photographed it, emailed Clara, and filed a police report for vandalism and tampering with legal signage. He installed 2 security cameras, one on the porch, one at the driveway's edge with motion sensors and night vision. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was building a record. The pressure didn't stop. A neighbor Henry barely knew approached while he was weeding. "It wouldn't kill you to let the kids through," the man said. "You've got all that space." Henry didn't reply. The man muttered something and left. It wasn't about Spacey, it was about control, about Susan convincing the street that Henry's land was theirs to claim. The real blow came on a Wednesday morning. A plain manila envelope arrived from the town's planning liaison, requesting a preliminary review of his driveway's usage classification. The letter cited consistent informal community use and neighbor-established passage norms as grounds for potential rezoning. The language was cold, bureaucratic, but its meaning was vicious. Because Susan's group had trespassed so often, the town was considering making it legal. A hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks, open to public comment. Henry called Clara immediately. "This isn't just about the driveway. she said after reviewing the letter. If this review passes without opposition, it's a step toward an easement. We need witness statements, photos, proof you've resisted every step. Otherwise, they'll say you've been complicit. Henry nodded, already pulling files. He had footage, dates, reports, but he needed allies. That was the problem. Most neighbors were either indifferent or quietly backing Susan, swayed by her talk of community and kids. Henry started knocking on doors, not with anger, but with purpose. At the first house, an older couple shrugged. Susan said it's always been shared, they said, avoiding his eyes. At the next, a younger man cut him off. I'm not getting into drama, dude. But not everyone shut him out. Margaret Voss, a quiet woman in her 40s who'd always kept to herself, invited him in. She remembered Henry moving in, admired his landscaping, and assumed the driveway was private. Susan tried to get me to sign something about neighborhood improvements, Margaret said. I didn't. It felt pushy. Henry asked if she'd provide a written statement. She agreed. Over the next week, Henry found a few others retirees, single parents, people who'd stayed out of Susan's orbit. They weren't a majority, but they were enough to chip away at her facade of unity. Clara compiled their statements, paired them with Henry's evidence, and prepared for the hearing. But 2 days before the meeting, Henry came home to find a town pickup truck parked across his driveway. A man in a reflective vest stood nearby, scribbling on a clipboard. What's this? Henry asked, stepping out of his truck. Just a site assessment for the planning board, the man said, barely looking up. Mapping pedestrian corridors. Nothing's approved yet. This is private property, Henry said. We were told it's under review. That gives us access. Not without my consent, Henry snapped. The man shrugged, jotted a note, and drove off. Henry photographed the truck's plates and sent everything to Clara. She was furious. They're acting like it's a done deal, she said. If we don't shut this down at the hearing, they'll use momentum to steamroll you. That night, Henry sat in his study, watching security footage. Grainy images showed kids running across his gravel, delivery trucks idling, Susan's guests laughing as they cut through. He saw himself on the porch, silent, restraining the urge to confront. Susan's strategy was clear: erode his resolve through repetition, make him question how much he'd tolerate to avoid a scene. But Henry was done hesitating. The hearing was his line in the sand. Henry Callahan arrived at the Willow Creek Community Center exactly on time, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. The room smelled of stale coffee and old carpet, its folding chairs filled with a mix of curious retirees, young parents, and a few teenagers slouched in the back. He wore a plain navy jacket, carrying a folder of documents and a quiet resolve that seemed to hush the murmurs as he entered. Clara Bennett sat beside him, her binder open, her pen poised like a weapon. Susan Hargrove was already there, seated 2 rows ahead, flanked by her usual supporters, loud, self-appointed neighborhood leaders who thrived on petty power. Her smile flickered when she saw Henry, but she quickly turned away, whispering to her group. The hearing began with the planning board's chair, a balding man named Roger Ellis, outlining the agenda in a monotone. The proposal was presented with polished slides, digitally enhanced maps of Birch Lane, Henry's driveway rendered as a potential pedestrian corridor, and vague promises of community enhancement. The language was slippery, heavy on ideals like connectivity and light on specifics. Susan spoke first, her voice syrupy with concern for our kids and neighborhood unity. She avoided mentioning the bounce house or Henry's objections, framing the issue as a simple misunderstanding over underutilized space. When it was Henry's turn, he stood still, his voice steady but firm. Clara handled the legal details, citing zoning laws, property records, and regional precedents with surgical precision. She presented photos of the vandalized signs, police reports, and statements from neighbors like Margaret Voss, who confirmed the driveway was private. But it was Henry's words that shifted the room. He didn't talk about statutes or easements. He spoke of the 12 days it took to lay his gravel by hand, the peace he'd sought after decades of loss, the strangers who'd trashed his land without asking. No one asked permission, he said, pausing to let the silence settle. Not once. The room grew still. A man in the back, a quiet electrician named Tom Reed who'd never spoken up before, stood and said, "He's right." We don't get to vote on someone's property. The comment broke Susan's spell. Whispers spread, and a few heads nodded. The board, sensing the shift, did what boards do best: they stalled. Ellis announced the proposal would be tabled for further review, a polite way of saying it was dead for now. Henry had won, not with a gavel or a headline, but with truth and patience. He expected relief, but what followed was escalation. 2 days later, he returned home to find a pile of mulch dumped along his driveway's edge, spread deliberately near his boundary stakes. The stakes themselves were uprooted, tossed into the bushes. It was vandalism disguised as carelessness, the kind that could pass as a landscaping mistake. Henry photographed it, filed a police report, and replaced the stakes with steel ones driven deeper. 3 days later, chalk drawings appeared on his gravel: smiley faces, peace signs, the word share in bold letters. He power washed them off and added infrared cameras angled to catch every angle. Susan didn't confront him directly, but her presence was everywhere. She led evening walks with families, pausing near Henry's property to point and gesture like a tour guide. Her laughter carried across the fence, louder than necessary. Flyers for local services tutors, lawn care began appearing in his mailbox, his name and address handwritten on each, as if he'd requested them. Then came the email, sent from an anonymous account to half the neighborhood, claiming Henry had threatened children near his driveway. No details, no proof, just poison meant to linger. Clara acted fast, drafting cease and desist letters and hiring a tech to trace the email's IP. Neighbors with cameras confirmed Henry was home during the alleged incident, but the damage was done. At the grocery store, the cashier who'd always chatted now barely looked up. A neighbor who'd once swapped gardening tips crossed the street to avoid him. Even Tom Reed, who'd backed him at the hearing, stopped waving. Susan wasn't aiming for a legal win, she was isolating him, tightening a social noose until he'd bend or break. Henry had faced worse. He'd watched his business collapse, not from poor work, but from competitors who undercut him with shoddy jobs. He'd rebuilt then, and he'd rebuild now. He stopped initiating greetings, spoke only when spoken to, and let the street's polite chatter fade. Clara filed a harassment complaint, citing the email, the vandalism, and the flyers as coordinated attacks. It wouldn't stick yet, but it was a signal. Henry wasn't the problem. One night, his motion lights triggered at midnight. The footage showed 2 teenagers on bikes riding up his driveway, one tossing a bag of nails across the gravel scattered, not dumped, meant to puncture tires. Henry swept them up, bagged them, and filed another report. The violations were small but relentless, designed to provoke a reaction Susan could twist into proof of his hostility. But Henry didn't snap. He ordered a load of gravel, not for the driveway, but for a low stone wall between his maples. He built it over 3 days, each stone fitted by hand, a boundary as permanent as his resolve. Susan watched from her lawn, phone in hand, pretending not to record. Henry ignored her. The wall wasn't just stone, it was a statement. When he finished, he stood at the driveway's edge, hands on his hips, and looked at his work. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. The street grew quieter after that. Kids stopped lingering, parents stopped staring. But Susan wasn't done. A Sunday morning brought a knock at his door. An officer, older than Tate, stood on the porch with a folder. "Mr. Callahan, we've got a complaint alleging harassment and threats against a minor and several residents." Henry's pulse quickened, but he stayed calm. "Who filed it?" "Multiple parties," the officer said. "They claim a pattern: yelling at kids, aggressive signs, blocking access." Henry gestured to his cameras. "Want to see the footage?" 2 weeks, high def, time-stamped. The officer, Captain Walsh, agreed. They sat in Henry's study, watching clips of him raking leaves, watering plants, nodding at passers-by. The only voices were kids laughing, not screaming. Walsh leaned back, rubbing his temple. "This doesn't match the report." "Of course not," Henry said. "It's not about truth. It's about noise." Walsh stood. "I'll log this, but you might consider a defamation claim." "This is messy." "Already working on it," Henry said. The officer left, visibly frustrated. Clara filed a temporary restraining order against Susan, citing the false accusations, vandalism, and harassment. The petition included footage, neighbor statements, and the anonymous email. Then came a break. A courier delivered an envelope from a local print shop, containing copies of Susan's flyers ordered under her name and number. Someone, likely a disgruntled employee, had leaked it. Clara upgraded the restraining order to a civil suit for defamation and property interference. The court date was set for 10 days later. In that time, the street's mood shifted. No one loitered near Henry's wall. The chalk stopped. Susan's walks ended farther down the block. Her laughter faded. For the first time, Henry felt the tide turning not toward warmth, but toward caution. The neighborhood was waking up to the cost of her campaign. The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low over Willow Creek like a judgment waiting to fall. Henry Callahan dressed in the same slate-gray jacket he'd worn to bid on contracts years ago, its fabric slightly worn but dignified. He didn't want to look like a victim or a crusader, just a man who knew the value of boundaries. Clara Bennett met him outside the courthouse, a squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights and clerks who moved like they were counting down to retirement. She handed him a revised brief, her expression calm but steely. "They'll try to paint you as the problem," she said. "Don't give them an inch. You don't need their sympathy, just the facts." Henry nodded, his jaw set. Inside, the courtroom was quieter than he'd expected, its pale walls and scuffed benches absorbing sound. Susan Hargrove arrived with her lawyer, a young man named Derek Powell, who spoke too loudly and gestured like he was auditioning for a TV drama. Susan's smile was thinner now, her eyes darting to Henry before settling on the judge's bench. She wore a tailored blazer, playing the part of a wronged community leader, but her confidence seemed brittle. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellen Carver, called the session to order with a no-nonsense efficiency. Powell went first, spinning a tale of neighborhood conflict and emotional distress caused by Henry's overly territorial behavior. He leaned hard on Susan's narrative, a mother trying to foster community, unfairly targeted by an aggressive loner. It was theatrical, but hollow, and Carver's frown deepened as he spoke. Clara stood next, her voice measured and unrelenting. She presented the evidence like a builder laying bricks, security footage showing no confrontations, photos of vandalized signs, police reports, and the print shop receipts tying Susan to the flyers she'd denied distributing. The anonymous email was traced to a coffee shop Wi-Fi, but Clara pointed out Susan's pattern of deception. The most damning moment came when Carver interrupted Powell. "Your client denied involvement with these flyers under oath," she said, holding up the receipts. "Care to explain?" Powell stammered, pivoting to vague claims about community misunderstanding. But the room had shifted. Susan's supporters, a handful who'd shown up, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clara finished with statements from Margaret Voss and Tom Reed, affirming Henry's restraint and Susan's aggression. Henry spoke briefly, his voice low but clear. "I moved here for peace," he said. "I've asked for nothing but respect for my property. Instead, I got lies, vandalism, and accusations. I'm here to protect what's mine." Carver didn't issue a full restraining order, but her ruling was pointed. She warned Susan against further interference or false claims, allowed the defamation suit to proceed, and ordered her to submit all relevant communications for a deposition. It wasn't a knockout, but it was a public rebuke, a crack in Susan's armor. As they left the courtroom, Henry caught Susan's eye. She didn't smile this time. Her lawyer hustled her out, muttering about appeals. Henry drove home under a light rain, the wipers slicing through the drizzle. He didn't feel triumphant, only resolute. That evening, he stood by the stone wall he'd built, watching water trickle along the gravel. The street was silent, no kids, no walkers, no Susan. He lit a fire in the backyard pit and sat beside it, the crackle of wood drowning out the world. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of the fight begin to lift. But Susan wasn't finished. The next week brought subtle jabs. A neighbor's dog, usually leashed, ran onto Henry's lawn and dug up a flower bed. A delivery truck mistakenly blocked his driveway for an hour. Then came a new flyer, this one for a neighborhood safety meeting, with a vague reference to recent tensions. Henry documented each incident, sent them to Clara, and waited. He knew Susan was testing the waters, probing for weakness. Clara pushed forward with the defamation suit, building a case around reputational harm and intentional malice. The deposition revealed Susan's emails to neighbors, framing Henry as unstable and urging them to stand up for the kids. Her lawyer tried to spin it as free speech, but the judge wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, Henry reinforced his property. He added solar floodlights along the driveway, their beams cutting through the main fog. He replaced the concrete sign with a cedar one, hand-carved and bolted to a steel post. Private property. No access. It stayed untouched. The neighborhood began to fracture. Susan's allies grew quieter, some distancing themselves as the lawsuit gained traction. Margaret Voss stopped by with a jar of homemade jam, saying nothing about the case but offering a small nod of respect. Tom Reed waved again, hesitant but deliberate. Others, though, doubled down. A petition circulated, calling for open streets and naming Henry's driveway as a barrier to community. It had fewer signatures than Susan's earlier efforts, but it stung. Henry felt the isolation creep in, not loneliness, but the ache of being cast as the villain in a story he hadn't written. One night, his cameras caught a figure in a hoodie spray painting his wall. The footage was blurry, but the act was bold, a red share scrawled across the stones. Henry power-washed it by morning and sent the video to Clara, who added it to the suit. The police identified the vandal as a teenager from Susan's circle, but his parents claimed it was just a prank. Henry didn't press charges, but he let the incident spread. Gossip turned, and Susan's name began to carry a different weight. The defamation case settled out of court 3 weeks later. Susan agreed to a 5-year moratorium on any petitions involving Henry's property and paid a modest sum for legal fees. It wasn't a fortune, but it was an admission of fault of overreach. Clara called it a win, but Henry saw it as a truce. Susan wasn't the type to vanish. She'd just regroup, wait for a softer target. For now, though, she was contained. Henry stood at his driveway's edge the day after the settlement, the cedar sign gleaming in the sun. The gravel was smooth, the walls solid, the maples casting long shadows. He'd fought not for glory, but for this, the right to stand on his land and call it his. The street was quiet, and that was enough. Henry Callahan woke to the sound of rain pattering on his tin roof, a soft rhythm that felt like the world exhaling. It was early June, and the air carried the scent of wet pine and fresh earth. The settlement with Susan Hargrove was 3 weeks past, and Willow Creek had settled into an uneasy calm. No new flyers appeared, no chalk marred his driveway, and the neighborhood's chatter had dulled to a murmur. Henry's stone wall stood firm, its edges softened by moss, and the cedar sign at his driveway's entrance gleamed under a fresh coat of sealant. He'd won not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd held his ground. The weeks after the court hearing had been a slow unraveling of Susan's influence. Her community events stopped, her evening walks faded, and her yard, once a stage for barbecues and banners, grew subdued. Henry noticed a for sale sign leaning against her garage one morning, never posted but a hint of her wavering resolve. Whether she was planning to leave or just dreaming of escape, he didn't care. His fight wasn't about her departure, it was about ensuring his land remained his own. And it had. Henry spent his days reclaiming what the conflict had disrupted. He replanted the flower beds trampled by Susan's guests, layering them with hardy perennials that could withstand Maine's fickle seasons. He extended the stone wall along the driveway's flank, not out of paranoia but pride, each stone a testament to his labor. The solar floodlights he'd installed cast a steady glow at night, and his cameras, now a permanent fixture, recorded nothing but deer and the occasional delivery van. The street was no longer a battleground, it was just a street. The neighborhood hadn't warmed to him, and Henry didn't expect it to. The polite nods of early days were gone, replaced by tight-lipped glances or hurried steps. At the hardware store, a cashier who'd once joked about mulch now rang him up in silence. The dog walker who'd stopped waving never resumed. But there were exceptions. Margaret Voss dropped off a basket of blueberries from a local farm, saying only, "Thought you'd like these." They talked for 10 minutes about soil pH and pruning, a small bridge across the divide. Tom Reed, the electrician who'd spoken up at the hearing, started nodding again, his wave tentative but sincere. These gestures weren't friendships, but they were enough proof that not everyone had bought Susan's narrative. Henry's life became deliberately inward. He let his front yard grow denser, planting native shrubs and evergreens that formed a natural curtain, not to hide, but to define his space. He walked the old orchard path behind his house, clearing deadwood and coaxing apple trees back to life. One afternoon, while digging near the path, he found a rusted garden spade, its handle worn smooth by some long-gone owner. It felt like a message from the land itself. Everything left a mark, every step endured. Henry kept the spade, propping it against his garage as a reminder. The legal fallout wrapped up quietly. Clara Bennett finalized the defamation settlement, ensuring Susan's 5-year ban on targeting Henry's property was ironclad. The modest payout covered his legal fees, but the real victory was the precedent. Susan's name no longer carried weight in town hall. When a new community connectivity proposal surfaced, Henry's driveway wasn't mentioned. Clara called to confirm, her voice dry but satisfied. "They've learned," she said. "You're untouchable now." Henry didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. The fight had never been about applause, it was about control, about drawing a line and defending it. He'd done that, not with anger or violence, but with evidence, patience, and an unyielding will. The street's silence was his reward, a stillness he'd earned through months of vigilance. One evening, as summer crept closer, Henry sat by his fire pit, the flames casting shadows across the backyard. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the only sound was the crackle of burning cedar. He thought of the bounce house, the chalk, the lies moments that had tested him, not just as a homeowner, but as a man. He'd faced worse in life: the slow bleed of his marriage, the collapse of his business, the years of starting over. This was just another trial, and he'd come through it whole. The next morning, he walked his property at dawn, coffee in hand, checking the boundaries as he always did. The gravel crunched under his boots, the maples swayed in a light breeze, and the wall stood as solid as ever. He paused at the cedar sign, running a hand over its carved letters. It wasn't just a marker, it was a declaration, a line no one would cross again. Birch Lane stretched out beyond, quiet and ordinary, its dramas faded into the past. Susan never spoke to him again. Her house stayed on the market for months, the sign finally posted in late summer. By fall, it was sold, and she was gone, leaving no note, no apology. Henry didn't mark her exit. He didn't need to. His land was his, the fight was over, and the peace he'd sought when he moved to Willow Creek was finally his to keep. Henry Callahan had built many things in his life: walls, gardens, a name. But this victory, carved from stone and silence, was his finest work. He stood at the edge of his driveway, the morning sun warming his face, and knew he'd done more than protect his property. He'd protected himself, his principles, his right to say no. And in that, he found a peace deeper than any he'd imagined. Thank you for following Henry's story. It's a tale of boundaries, resilience, and the cost of standing firm against injustice. What do you think about the themes of violation and fairness here? Have you ever faced a situation where your rights were challenged, or seen someone pushed too far under the guise of community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective, whether you side with Henry, see Susan's point, or land somewhere in between. Let's talk about what justice means in our lives and how we navigate the tension between personal rights and collective pressure. Your voice matters. Join the conversation.